All right, everyone, we're ready to get started. First of all, I would like to welcome Tyrone Grandison. We are so honored to have you here today. Dr. Grandison, we're going to get started, and I'll just do a very short introduction just so everyone can learn a little bit more about you before we hear some of your insights. Dr. Grandison holds multiple chief technology positions at the telehealth market, Hodos Health, and M Street X. Hope I'm getting those right. He's also the founder and board chairman of the Data Driven Institute, which is a public health nonprofit that helps policymakers create and implement effective programs and policies to solve their most critical problems using the knowledge of the community, data, and technology. While at the Data Driven Institute, Dr. Grandison had the honor of serving in several positions for the company's clients and partners. He served as executive leadership advisor for Democracy Works. He served as civic tech program manager for the US Census Bureau. Be kind of interesting to hear a little bit about that. Actually, I don't mean a lot of people from the Census Bureau myself. And he served as the first chief technology officer for Pearl Long-Term Care Solutions. And that's just a sample of the bio. But I know you have a lot to present today, so I will pass it to you and I'll turn off my camera just so we can focus on your slides. Thank you so much and welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience who has taken some time out of their Saturday to be here with me. And I know you have options. You could be any one or anywhere of like 3 other locations. So I'm really honored. I'm going to talk about data from the perspective of government. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about open data, open government data, and not necessarily talk about like if you are on the other side and wanting to produce data for government to consume. That's not what this talk is about. I like to start all these talks with the why. And in this case, it's 3 different whys that I want to actually like just start with. The first is, why am I speaking? Why are you listening to me? Why am I the one giving this presentation? I started off as a software engineer, so my Ph.D is in software engineering. I got an executive advanced MBA from the Academy of Technology in IBM. I am a data engineer and data scientist before the terms became popular at all. I'm not going to date myself, but think decades. And I've had the fortune to actually be an executive and a consultant for way too many companies and seeing, the full spectrum across both industry, nonprofit, government, and consulting. So the reason why I think I was chosen to give this talk was back in 2014, I was a Presidential Innovation Fellow working with the White House with President Obama on his open data initiatives. After that, I was the Deputy Chief Data Officer for the Department of Commerce, which meant that I had the open data platform / pillar, and I oversaw the data initiatives across all the bureaus of the Department of Commerce, which, if you know commerce, it's one of the most data intensive agencies within the Federal Bureau. So we're talking about NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're talking about the Census Bureau. We're talking about NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. We're talking about PTO, Patent and Trademark Office, and a bunch more of different agencies. I also was the first Chief Information Officer for the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. They're an outfit that looks at data across every single locality in every single city of the world and produces data and visualizations that tell you what are the risk factors, diseases, and injuries that will shorten people's lives and that will kill them. Right now, they're more famous for producing COVID projections for the US. And as mentioned before, I am the executive director and founder for the Data Driven Institute. The second why is this topic important? And it's important because only government can actually invest in the fundamental systems and technologies that may or may not have a profit margin attached to it. The private sector can take on, elastic problems like entertainment and marketing, while the government has to take on like the harder problems, the harder inelastic problems like homelessness and health, safety, defense, trade, mobility, social justice, because no one else will. The private sector will never ever take those on because there is no profit motive for any of them. And the third why is, why should you care? And I'm hoping that throughout this presentation that you'll see that you should care because your life depends upon open government data. And without it, the pleasures and the creature comforts that we have right now would not exist and will be gone in a blink of an eye. Quick example, the US Census Bureau. So if you look at the data that the Census Bureau actually puts out there and the uses of it, without it, everything that's involved in education funding, housing, disaster response, voting and elections, and social services would not happen. Like they would just stop. I'm going to try and guide us through this flow for this talk, so to speak, like speak about what data is in government, open data, talk to the history of it, uh, speak to what the guidance is on open data initiatives, and then walk through a few examples, essentially just like stories, stories that I've actually either led or worked on, and some stories that are just out there that leverage government data, and talk through the lessons that I've actually learned over time. And I want something from you. I want the people that are listening, that are here, to actually get involved. So let's start off with open data. Like, what are we talking about? What does this mean? So when you're talking about open data in this context, there are three different concepts that you have to like put your mind around. There's a concept of openness, which comes from the scientific evidence world. There's a concept of government and governance and bureaucracy, which, mind you, it's vilified now, but bureaucracy is just basically a coordinated bunch of people that are there to put in motion actions that take care of some needs, right? So in the definition of bureaucracy and government and governance itself, there is no polarity there. And data, which is purely technical, right? When you actually intersect the worlds of open and data, you have the technological perspective of like, how should we actually craft a data set such that other people can actually use them? When you're talking about combining government and openness, we're talking about how do we have transparent bureaucracy that people can actually see in, and that's all political. We're talking about data and government. We're talking about like how do we make the bureaucracy like work effectively. When you put them all together, you basically have what we're going to talk about today, and that includes all three aspects plus an economic value component to it. Now, there are many definitions out there. You can actually go back and see definitions. I'd probably go back to around like 2007-ish. And they've defined like different types of open data, different types of data in the open space that you'll see. The thing to note here is that there are two elements, right, to openness that are critical for us. The first is a legal element, and that means that you should be allowed to get the data legally, to build on it, and to share it. You can normally do this by either putting an open license on your data or putting your data in the open domain, right? So that element has to be in place. The second element, as we hinted at earlier, is the technical openness element. And that goes to the point of not having any technical barriers to the data itself. If you put a table in a PDF or in a paper that is printed off, that does not meet the technical openness kind of requirement that we want for open data. So sorry to say, tables and PDFs are no, no. Just say no. When it comes to open data, there are three principles that we're all trying to get at. Like the first is availability and access, so that anyone can get the data whenever they want. The second is reuse and redistribution, so people can reuse and reshare the data. And the third is what they call universal participation. So you want anyone to be able to use the data at all, like in whatever form, in whatever way they want. Let's take the example of the cell phone, right? And this is one of the better examples I could find of like how open data powers the things that we currently just can't live without. Where do I start here? So like take the material standards for manufacturing the phone. Like they all rely on information from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, open data. The intellectual property for the technology itself, that's safeguarded by the Patent and Trademarking Office, open data. Your weather app, it relies on data that's collected from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, open data. The stock app tells you um, the impact of jobs and impact of actions on the economy that uses GDP statistical release data from BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, again, open data. Telecommunications and spectra on the devices, that's influenced by NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, a part of the Department of Commerce. Again, open data. All the components of the devices, that's trade. That's ITA, International Trade Administration. The startups that actually make the apps, that make the phones, I mean, all are influenced by the Economic Development Administration and by the Minority Development Business Administration, ED and MBDA. Again, all open data. To put a finer point on it, the global weather industry, that only uses 10% of the data that is collected by NOAA. And in 2016, that entire industry was valued at like $2.1 billion. The interesting thing to note is that all the companies and the apps that you use right now, people think that, you know, weather data that they actually get and use comes from some proprietary source, or they have some secret magic. Their secret magic is in repackaging and reskinning NOAA's open data. And the percentage of this data that's being accessible and the possible uses are just mind-boggling. With NOAA's big data project, a collaboration with cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, more and more of this 10%, more and more of the percentage of data within NOAA is actually being extracted and used. So there is a lot of hope there. When it comes to the history of open data, and I'm going to look at this from the purely policy perspective, everywhere you read, there is the mention of, somewhere in 1995, there was a scientific agency. We're not quite sure if it was NIST or if it was somewhere in the health tech space, that mentions open data, right? What we do know is that there was, in December of 2007, a meeting of around 30 different, internet luminaries in California, and they defined, the term open public data. And then they got all the US presidential candidates at the time to actually adopt a definition and to include it in their platforms. So 2008, President Obama wins and takes office. January 21st of 2009, he signs the Memorandum on Transparency and Open Government, which has a carve-out there, a placeholder for an open data policy. Come 2013, and he issues M1313, well, that's what it's fondly known as, the Open Data Executive Order. And that requires that from this point on, all data generated by government should be made available in open, machine-readable formats while safeguarding privacy and confidentiality and security. Perfect. That begins the mandate, the boom, right? Come 2017, and President Trump, well, actually, the House and Senate at the time, under President Trump, puts into motion the Open Public Electronic and Necessary Government Data Act, the Open Government Data Act. It passes the Senate, the House, goes back to the House. And come January 19, 2019, we have the Open Government Data Act, which mandates that everything produced by the federal government has to have some reference, not reference, but some reference, well, actually it is a reference, some pointer back to the government's actually open data repository, right? And it has to be open. So if you look at, M1313, where the second step in where this all started, it basically says that we should do better, right? We should do better in terms of the data that we actually produce and how the American people can actually leverage that data. When we look at the Open Government Data Act, as I said before, it mandates that the metadata itself has to be in data.gov's catalog, right? In terms of guidance, so think about from the memorandum, which was in 2009 until currently, like everyone is in startup ramp-up mode, and that was the period in which I was actually playing in this space. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, provided a not a timeline, but a series of steps that you have to take to help agencies actually produce open government data. The first is that it should be, free and unrestricted. So you deal with the technical and the legal aspects that you have to deal with. The second is that you should engage in users. That was and continues to be novel. The third is that you should use formats that anyone can have access to, which to this day is still a big problem within the federal and most governments. You should fully describe the data, so make sure that all the metadata files are actually correct and easy to understand. And you should facilitate discovery for all users of your data. When it comes to not just creating the open data sets, but creating the open data portals, if you were to look at the 2017 European Data Portal report, it gives you like 10 things you have to do. And many of us, like in terms of many of the people working within municipalities are still struggling to, get our partners and collaborators to kind of get this and to implement these 10 different recommendations. Like the first thing is just like the data that you have in there should be measurable. Like when we talk about data, it's normally about something, an entity that we're trying to measure, to track, such that we can actually do something with that measurement, right? If you are producing data and publishing data that does not have to do with something that can be measurable and actionable, then we need to talk, right? They also recommend that you promote the use of the data. You organize the data so it can actually be used. You make it accessible to as many different segments as possible. You not only promote, but you use standards as much as possible. Publish the metadata. You make sure it can be linked, and it is linked to other data sets and other things that are actually relevant. You co-locate it with documentation as to how to use it and how to decipher it. And then you co-locate it with tools, and again, make it discoverable. So now I'm gonna go into the portion where I talk about, the examples of open data projects. I'm gonna start with the ones that, I've been a part of, I've actively worked on. And I'm just gonna do it chronologically. So, don't look for a theme, don't look for like how they're connected. It's just like, this is just what I've worked on throughout my career. So the first one was, remember I mentioned that I was a Presidential Innovation Fellow at the Department of Labor and Census Bureau. So this was one of the first projects that I worked on, and it's called Sweat and Toil. And it was done in collaboration with the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, ILAB is what we fondly call it. And ILAB's mission is to make sure that the working conditions of people across the world get better, right? Now, ILAB has a congressional mandate every year to produce a report on the goods and the products that use forced and child labor. And every year they spend 9 months collecting data and collating the data for this report. They produce a 1,000-page report that they present to Congress in like September, October every year. And they produce a PDF as well. And that's it. They hope people use it. They hope it makes sense. So the idea, for the team that was working on this was very simple. How about we liberate the data and make it available to the wider community and see what new interesting things can actually be done? So this led us to two things. This led us to the production of the open data set for iLab around forced and child labor. And it led to this app called Sweat and Toil that you can actually get on Android or on an Apple. The data itself, if you want to actually leverage or use it, the GitHub link that was on that first slide a few slides back, like that would actually give you that information. To put a final point on it, at the time, there were also a lot of other open data initiatives within the Department of Labor. None of these I personally worked on, but colleagues of mine have. The Bureau for Labor Statistics has their local data app that can tell you everything about the labor market in your particular region. ETA, the Employee Training Administration, has their Career Info app that tells you everything you need to know about a particular occupation. OSHA, Occupation Safety and Health Administration, they have a heat safety tool that can help you figure out not only stuff around your crops, but stuff around like workers in the field, and it's available in both English and Spanish. DOL has a timesheet app that helps you hopefully mitigate the concerns or the issues or quantify if there's like wage theft happening somewhere. And ET again has their career one-stop tool that allows you to explore trainings and career moves and help you like plan that career transition, right? Also, iLab has other tools and Career One Stop. Well, we already mentioned that. The next project that I worked on was Census's City SDK project. And that project was pretty simple. It was a software development kit that wanted to do several things. Like one, Census realized that they had a problem with people using their data via their API, right? And they couldn't figure out why. So what we did was that we spoke to a bunch of their users, their user groups. We figured out that there were some issues with flow, and we basically built an API on top of their API that made it more seamless and less complicated for people to actually use Census API. Our strategy was that we would actually partner with different people in the space, showcase this API, and long-term transition the functionality back into Census's production platform. One of the examples, I'm just going to play this, of our partners.
Articulate Solutions is a big data and predictive analytics company.
We collect data from both our clients and publicly available resources and create models specific to each that helps us create recommendations that client should then use in their marketing communication.
The United States Census Bureau data is extremely helpful to us because it's both very consistent, accurate, and we know that it's going to be available. My name is Adam Schreiser, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Original Solutions.
I'm Rachel Bender, CTO of Original Solutions.
We take all the data sets that a company may have about their consumer, their social media, their email marketing platform, their customer relationship management database. We then run our proprietary algorithms and analytics engine and come up with models that can tell us how individual consumers are likely to behave and what marketing messages and communications are most likely to influence those people's behavior.
We use census data to help supplement that data. For smaller companies, their data sets are not robust enough. With census data, we're able to provide recommendations on a much richer data set and make it possible for small clients to use predictive analytics. What we see with larger clients that may have already had the ability to do predictive analytics is that census data makes those predictions more accurate.
I ask everybody for $100. There's probably a large percentage of people who will actually give me $20. But how many of them would have given $125, $150 had I known to actually ask for it?
Most of the data that we collect from the Census Bureau revolves around the environments in which people live.
Information about housing, economic growth, different educational patterns, all within specific geographic locations, by zip code, by county, by state.
Original Solutions has always used census data. However, in the past, it's been a very manual process.
Are you able to put the volume up a little bit?
Implement our models and incorporate census data.
This is as loud as it gets for me.
We've actually programmed with that API to include all of the census data that we feel is predictive for that client, and this happens within a matter of minutes. This allows us to free up our technical resources for other initiatives and save costs on delivering to our clients. We're actually able to serve more clients who would not otherwise be able to afford predictive analytics.
Many large companies have entire departments to simply gather and collect a populous data set to perform the analysis they actually want. Smaller and medium-sized companies, they don't have that specific group of people whose sole job is to collect and gather these data sets.
What we can do at City SDK is collect about 26,000 data points and let our algorithms do the work.
In one example, the use of City SDK and United States Census Bureau data allowed us to actually make predictions on 68,000 more people for specific one of our customers, 219% more people than we could actually make predictions on originally. The United States Census Bureau data is actually owned by the American public. Our government makes this resource available to anybody who wants to use it. And that's a very important component to the service we provide.
Census data has been very impactful to us as a company and to our clients, and it really shows in the numbers.
So Arjuna Solutions was one of our more prominent partners in the City SDK initiative. And I apologize if the volume was on the attendee side wasn't loud. I will make the slides available so you can actually hear and see it yourself afterwards. As I said before, part of our strategy was, how do we actually go out there and partner with people to figure out how they can actually leverage federal data, like federal census data, with their own data sets and solve their own local problems. While doing this, there are an amazing set of solutions that actually came up. It's like everything from how do you actually get parks to have equitable access in Austin, to finding civic tech spaces in DC, to helping food truck operators find the best spot to get clients or to maximize on rush hour, to providing a secondary market for organic food that is going off, to helping find a data-driven approach for people actually re-entering society from being incarcerated, to scoring the accessibility of different locations in Minnesota, to providing solutions for young women of color, trying to stem the school to prison pipeline. The very end of it, it was moderately successful. We had a bunch of partners, we had a bunch of collaborations with local governments. We saw growth and we saw interest. But the more important thing was that we saw impact, and we basically made sure that the data that is ours, that we're all paying for, was more accessible. In that same vein, we started the Opportunity Project. I forget which year, I think it was back in 2015-ish. And the premise of the Opportunity Project was very simple. Like, your zip code should not determine where you can actually rise to or the opportunities that are actually available to you. So here, the basis of it was similar to the City SDK project, is how do we actually engage with the business community and with the general public themselves, such that we ran them through a development and sprint process whereby they're using federal data to solve the problems that were more pressing to them and they were passionate about. This project is actually still vibrant and up and running today and being led by the Census Open Innovation Labs. The next initiative was one that happened as a part of Commerce. So while at Commerce, I was one of the co-founders of a little startup within the department called the Commerce Data Service. And as a part of the Commerce Data Service, we basically had a team where we went around and we tried to showcase the power of open data, right? And this was one of the projects that allowed us to actually do it. With this project, what we aimed to do was very simple. We did a survey of all the different bureaus within the Department of Commerce. We asked our users to actually like prioritize them and figure out like what the list of high value data sets were. And then we provided a step-by-step guide for people as to how to leverage it, a possible use case for it, and then had them go off and figure out like what was next, what could they do with it. And a few examples. So in one case, we used the hail data from NOAA to understand weather risk. So to help farmers in the middle of the US figure out when there was a possibility of hail and when they should actually either protect their crops, or even a homeowner somewhere in the US, like at what particular point in the year should they actually implement anti-hail mechanisms. We leveraged data from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They have their CVD, their vulnerability database. And we basically just like looked at the database and found patterns around it, and we're able to communicate and interface with businesses to help us actually get to a resolution for these vulnerabilities quicker. We could also see a timeline of when things were actually happening, if we were able to access the data in as real time as possible. Then there is VIIRS data, so visible infrared data, so light data from NOAA. And interestingly enough, like we found that the VIIRS dataset was an amazing proxy for many, many things, right? In this one example, we show people how to process VIIRS satellite imagery data. And then we show an example of how it could actually accurately be used to predict GDP anywhere in the US. We leveraged Census's ACS, the American Community Survey data. So the ACS, if you know, like contains a ridiculous amount of dimensions across multiple different geographic locations. And here we basically, wrote up, these are all essentially just like notebooks, right? We wrote up a notebook that showed people how to access the dimensions for any particular person or customer type that they're looking for. and find out how many of those particular type of customers are actually in their particular location or nearby. Here we used housing data from Zillow to help people in the emergency response, firefighters, police, people that generally may not have access to the funds needed to actually buy, really expensive homes, figure out like, where in the US is it affordable to buy a house on my particular salary, right? And again, these are all just very simple step-by-step guides with code as to how to actually do this, but also with a hint of, here's something else that you probably could actually do as well, right? So the next one was using atmospheric rivers data from NOAA. So atmospheric rivers are essentially just like trade winds, high above us and a few strata above. And this is where you actually get like weather patterns being moved from one location to the other. People don't normally think about it, but what we showed was basically how to access this data to actually figure out like what phenomenon is going to be where and why, because this gives us a really accurate description of what's going on. Here we actually partnered with an environmental consulting agency and leveraged the data from the Census Bureau, the topological data at this point, to figure out like where businesses should actually put their next location such that it has like the least environmental impact possible. If you are into invention and wanted to analyze the Patent and Trademark Office's data to see anything from trends over time to the most popular different areas for invention, we show you how to unwrap that data itself and then how to use it for your own analysis. So those were, the list of some of the things that we did to democratize data and to provide open data sets that were already publicly available, right? They weren't probably in the formats or accessible the way people thought. So our mission was, how do we make it so and how do we show the way, right? There are also a lot of other examples out there. I mean, and these examples I have not worked on and I have no connection with. Like very few people know that in real time, you can actually track every single airplane trip happening in real time anywhere in the world, right? Open Sky Network is just one website that allows you to do it. But any website that actually accesses the FAA, Federal Aviation Agency's ADS-B data. So back up. So ADS-B is all airplanes have an ADS-B transponder. And ADS-B is basically a little box that sends a signal up to a satellite that sends it back down to FAA servers and, well, actually the servers of like all aviation agencies. And that allows us to actually see at any point in time, like where a plane is and what's happening with it, right? So that is completely possible. And if you want to, you could leverage that data to do whatever you need. Not a government agency, the C3.ai, but a great example of how government data is actually being used for COVID-19. So C3.ai has a COVID-19 data lake where they basically consolidate, at this point, I think it's over 50 different data sources, all open data sets, everything from CDC to World Health Organization to Census Bureau. And they provide you with like a single API where you can analyze every single aspect of COVID-19, both in terms of like academic research and in terms of actual numbers happening, in terms of cases and policy, and well, at some point, hopefully vaccines, right? If you are into politics and want to look at, redistricting, there is District Builder that is a free and open source redistricting tool that leverages open data, Census Bureau, to help you figure out how can you draw a more equitable and fair map for your district. In pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic times, if you're a parent and looking for a good school that not only is gonna, have the right check marks for your particular child, but also has, the right ROI in terms of the degree and past graduates, then, greatschools.org uses Department of Education's open data, and it externalizes that for you, so you can actually do queries. If you're into seeing how your elected officials are actually being influenced, OpenSecrets.org uses the Federal Elections Commission's open data and externalizes that for you. As an extension, if you're looking for influence and how companies and lawmakers and prominent officials are actually influencing decisions happening, Infos Explorer exposes that public data, and that uses a mix of, again, FEC open data, census open data, and some other tools that are existing. If you go local, and this is where the fun happens, right? So, I started off at the federal level. There was a mandate that said that all federal data, has to be open at this point. A lot of cities actually took this on and internalized it and produced their own open data portals, and also had their own open data initiatives. Seattle and San Francisco are, good examples of portals that are, used fairly frequently. If you're looking for insight, and this image and this link is hyperlinked, so you can actually see the impact of open data initiatives across the world. Like the Sunlight Foundation curates a list, and this links to that particular list. And I'll give that to the team afterwards. All right, so now for why I think you're here. So the lessons, what have I learned having done this for quite a bit of time? The first thing is that unfunded mandates are not great. I mean, they can only push momentum and push progress so far. And just to make it explicit, the M1313 was an unfunded mandate, right? The Open Data Executive Order was saying you have to do this, but we're not going to provide you any money or resources to do it. You just do it as a part of goodness. You can obviously see where that's going to lead. Being compliant with these laws, whether it's the Open Government Data Act or some local law, does not mean that you're going to produce an open data and an open data portal that is actually useful. It's I've seen entities that have actually just pushed out data sets, low-hanging fruit that's actually available. And one, the data that they're pushing out there is not relevant to anybody. Two, once they push it out there, they never ever update it, so it becomes stale and useless pretty quickly. So both of these things are way too common in the space, so to speak, and it stems from the unfunded portion, I think. The third lesson here is that interoperability, even though it's been a goal forever, it's still very low. The one case or example that keeps popping to my mind is in traffic data, and look at different parts of, say, pick a random city, Chicago. Say Chicago and a neighboring city are publishing open data sets on traffic fatalities. And in it, they have, some mention of an intersection, but like City A defines intersection as a place where um, 3 or more different roads meet, and the City B defines it as where like 4 or more roads meet, right? So, they're publishing open data, they're using the same terms. The terms mean something completely different for each city, and they haven't spoken to each other. And the data sets, even though on the surface they seem like they should be able to work and talk to each other, and you should be able to use them, you have to dig into it and make sure that the metadata says that. Right now, that is too much the case. For us to actually have like, useful interoperability. And contrary to popular belief, if you build it, they will not come. So I said before, just because, you are compliant and you put something out there as an open data set, and you have an open data portal, it doesn't mean that what you're putting out there is relevant, or it doesn't mean it's actually going to be useful. And in the early days, this was pretty much the case. You're just putting things out there that were irrelevant and very unuseful. Now, we are really good, and I think, everyone at this point has heard the phrase like, what gets measured gets managed. The thing is just like, what you're measuring often does not provide insight into the messiness of like the fundamental or the underlying processes, which is, where the important and the actionable information is, right? Now, to do better, we don't only have to actually have like precise and really well-defined data measures on inputs. We also have to have measures on outcomes and impacts, right? So, we're very good, like both at the federal and the local level, of putting data out there that are representing input measures, right? But if you're measuring, say, an input, it's a quick example, the number of minorities on a particular team for a particular organization, that's great, right? It doesn't capture the outcome, such as the decision making that reflects diverse perspectives. And it doesn't capture the impact, like the social value of those decisions themselves, right? So we need to actually transition to not only measuring the inputs, but also figuring out how do we actually measure the outcomes and the impacts, because that's where real change happens. And no matter what anyone tells you, all of this is about change management in the direction of hopefully the positive and the better. The next lesson is interesting, and it took me a while to actually get, and it's not obvious to most. So like when we're seeking to look at a phenomenon and to capture causality, we often draw the wrong boundaries around the problems that we're trying to solve. And when this happens, like data and the measurements that they reflect lead us astray. And they prevent us from actually like doing the things that are bigger, bolder, more impactful. And the example that I like to use here is the US government, like back in the 70s, a classic example. So, we want to make sure that our cars are going to be fuel efficient. So the US government says, we are going to actually have fuel economy standards for car companies, for passenger cars. And we're going to measure, their compliance with this fuel standards. And slowly, we're going to actually make those standards more rigorous, such that we can have the impact that we want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is that these fuel standards were, again, very focused. on just passenger cars. What the automobile industry did was it reduced the production in passenger cars and then ramped up the production in light SUVs, light heavy vehicles, to the point where they were compliant with the fuel economy standards, and they were actually like able to produce a new income stream that was more profitable, right? So the unintended consequence there of like a good idea that was really focused on how to improve the fuel economy of passenger cars leads to a situation where, you know, you don't have an impact on emissions actually going down. You have more accidents because you have more heavier vehicles crashing into like lighter vehicles. And you don't actually solve the real problem because you're focusing narrowly and missing the entire system itself. And then you have no unintended consequences that are still lasting decades. So, and this is just like the lesson I learned about like when you're doing a data project, like figure out what the ecosystem is that you're playing in, and figure out the consequences or the things that are nearby that you have to factor in when you're thinking about what you need to measure, what you need to collect, and how you plan to actually use it. And you could think of like many different examples and many different scenarios, both at the local and federal level that prove this point. My thing with always going back to the 1970s example was this like, it's very clear, you know, from 1971 to like 2000, like the proportion of like light SUVs in the automobile industry was like around 2%. By the 2000s, it was like around 50, 51-ish percent. um, and, you know, nothing got better, right? So at that point, you know, that's a lesson that we should have learned in the open data community coming in, because like we didn't start trekking until like, you know, the late 2000s. And the fact that it's taken a bunch of projects for us to actually like see it or relearn it, that's disheartening. The next lesson is that we tend to focus on what we think is, and this goes for everyone, what we think is profitable, right? Not profitable, but what we think we can actually monetize, right? And some things are just easier to measure than others, right? But it doesn't mean that those things are valuable. The example here that makes the most sense is like CO2 emissions. Very easy to actually measure. A nice single measure that tells us like what the impact is on the climate. Once you measure it, you can monetize it. You can have like a carbon price. You can have a carbon market. You can compare across companies and activities, but it doesn't tell you as much as if you were to say measure or model or have data on the impact on biodiversity and habit, which are the next two, well, the next two in a line of like 5 different crises that we have to actually deal with or grapple with, right? So measuring the things that are not easy and not obvious is what we have to actually start thinking about. And the things that are even obvious may not always translate into like what is valuable. The final lesson is that if you don't have feedback, and more importantly, if you don't capitalize or leverage that feedback, you know, your open data and your open data portal and the impact that it's going to have is going to be obsolete like really quickly, because it's the data that you have is stagnating. And the one thing you know about data is that the value in data is when you can actually see progressions, when you can actually see the trend line. With that, I want to call you to do something. right? I want you to adopt an agency, whether the agency is federal or local, I do not care, right? All our government bodies need our help. Pick a government body that is like close, near and dear to your heart, close to a problem that you want to actually solve. Look at their open data strategy if they have one. Look at the data that they currently produce. Where is it? Is it currently open? If they need to, help them with an open data strategy. Advocate for them so they can get the necessary funding and resources to actually create this data that you can then leverage. Invite your friends, make sure that they're on board and they actually do advocacy work with you. And finally, force them to be better, to do better, because compliance is not necessarily anything to do with utility or value, and compliance should never be a driving force for anything. But sadly, this is the world we live in. With that, I thank you, and I will close it there. I have not looked at the chat window. I don't have access to anything, and I'm not sure what's going on. So I'm gonna ask for help on figuring out how do we do Q&A.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was just fascinating. I have so many questions, but we have about 3 minutes here. I'll ask my one question here, and if someone wanted to drop something in the chat, I can read it out loud here. But for now, that was truly eye-opening, the number of resources that you indicated that are available just out there that I would never really think to access. First of all, I'm hoping you could send a document or something that we could send around. A lot of them I just was not aware of personally. And I guess my question is, where to even begin? I mean, we are very critical of, especially the younger generations, saying they tend to just go to Wikipedia right away. If you're not sure how
Mhm.
to check information. I'm an old millennial, so for us it was an encyclopedia. But just for the modern age, what is a good place for us to start? And I know it's a very broad question because it depends on the field, but do you have any suggestions? It looks like a lot of government websites you're recommending is a good place to start.
Yeah, so my talk was on government, so that's that's why the focus. So because the Open Government Data Act like mandates that data.gov has to play a part in where all these federal data sets sits,
Mhm,
like you start with data.gov and you start with the Census Bureau,
mhm.
and you pretty much have like 60-70% of what's out there, right?
Okay.
Then you do a search on, your city or your county or your state, and then put open data after it, and you
Mhm.
get the rest of your 30-ish%.
And I thought the point you were making about zip codes, how that shouldn't specifically determine your fate, it really seems like it's two parts what you're recommending. One part is knowing where to look for the information, but the other part is having the knowledge of what to do with it in the first place.
Yep.
So, I mean, we can certainly find the sites that you're recommending, make the most of government resources. But what is your suggestion for empowering people to learn how to make the most of that data?
I would say like leverage the Commerce Data Usability Project as much as possible. A lot of it so a lot of it got shelved during the Trump administration. Some of it still exists in various forms.
Mhm.
I would say reach out to the chief data officers. What is it called? Council at this point. There is a chief data officer council at the federal level, and they should be able to actually help you figure out like how do we actually leverage and use these data sets.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I hope you'll share your slides with us if that's possible.
Oh
I'd
yes, definitely.
available just because
Yes.
you have so many great resources there. I would love to spend some time with it myself, really. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time this weekend. I know it's a Saturday and a pretty nice day too. So,
Oh, thank you so much. Have a good one, everybody. Bye bye.
all right. And we hope that everyone will join us for the fireside chat next in about 15 minutes. See you there. Bye.
Bye bye.